A simple 911 call from a concerned neighbor would set off a chain of events that led to one of the most shocking and horrific murders the town had ever seen. What seemed like a routine emergency quickly unraveled into a story filled with betrayal, jealousy, and a deadly secret that no one could have predicted. The truth behind the murder was darker than anyone could have imagined. And the eerie call was only the beginning of a twisted tale that would leave the community reeling. It was a quiet evening on Oak Street, the kind where the soft glow of porch lights illuminated manicured lawns, and the hum of suburban life filled the air. The Smith family's home stood as a symbol of peace and normalcy, nestled between neighbors who had known each other for years. Inside, Sarah Smith had just finished cleaning up after dinner. Her husband, John, was reading the newspaper, and their two children were settling in for the night. The house exuded warmth, the kind of place that looked like nothing bad could ever happen. But as night fell, something began to stir within the house that would forever shatter its peaceful facade. A neighbor, who had always kept a close ear on the street's happenings, noticed something wasn't right. There was a strange noise coming from the Smith home, yelling, banging, and the unmistakable sound of a struggle. It was not the usual late night argument that sometimes happened between married couples. This was different. It was frantic, desperate, and filled with tension. The neighbor, alarmed by what they heard, immediately called 911. Their voice trembled with fear as they reported the unusual sounds from next door, unsure of what was unfolding, but certain that something was terribly wrong. The dispatcher, trying to make sense of the chaotic situation, asked if anyone had seen anything or if there was any sign of violence. The caller's response was only more confusion and panic as the noises abruptly stopped. The line went eerily silent before the dispatcher hung up, unable to get any further information. The clock was ticking, and what had started as a mere noise would soon become a grisly crime scene. When police arrived at the Smith home, they were met with an unsettling stillness. The front door was ajar, and the lights inside flickered ominously, casting long shadows across the living room. Officers cautiously stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The house, once a haven of normalcy, now felt alien, as if something vital had been ripped from its very core. As they moved deeper into the home, they found John Smith sprawled across the living room floor, his lifeless body surrounded by pools of blood. It was clear that he hadn't died from an accident. There were signs of a violent struggle, and the severity of his injuries suggested something far more deliberate. But there was no sign of Sarah. At first, the scene seemed to point to an accident, a sudden outburst of violence from an unknown intruder. However, there was an unsettling detail. The blood splatter didn't match what one would expect from a random attack. It was contained, concentrated, and it seemed to tell a story of its own, a story of someone who had been cornered. The officers began to search the rest of the house, their tension growing with every room they entered. As they approached the master bedroom, they noticed something strange, a faint smell of perfume and the sense that something was off. The room was untouched, but the bed had been disturbed, as if someone had been hiding there. With no immediate sign of Sarah, the officers' minds began to race. Could she be hiding? Had she been involved in the murder? Or was she in danger herself? The 911 call, the silence that followed, and now the scene before them all pointed to one terrifying possibility. Sarah Smith was somehow connected to this violent death. As investigators dug deeper into the Smith family's life, they began to uncover a web of secrets that had been carefully hidden behind the facade of suburban perfection. John Smith, a successful businessman, was well liked in the community, respected by colleagues and neighbors alike. But as they spoke with friends and coworkers, a different side of John began to emerge. It turned out that John had been having an affair with a woman from his office, someone he had met during a business trip months earlier. His affair was a carefully guarded secret, and Sarah, his wife, had no idea about the betrayal that had been unfolding right under her nose. The news of the affair shocked those closest to the Smiths. To many, John had been the picture of devotion, a loving husband and father. But the truth was far darker. The affair was not just a passing fling. It was a full-blown relationship that John had kept secret for months, sneaking around behind his family's back. Investigators also learned that John had been increasingly distant, spending more nights away from home under the guise of business trips. Sarah, oblivious to her husband's infidelity, had noticed his emotional distance but had no reason to suspect anything so devastating. She tried to ignore the growing tension between them, focusing on their children and trying to keep up appearances. But everything came crashing down that fateful night. When Sarah found out about the affair, the argument between her and John escalated quickly. Fueled by anger, betrayal, and heartbreak, Sarah confronted him in a rage that spiraled out of control. What started as a heated argument quickly became violent, and before she knew it, Sarah had struck John. But was this just a crime of passion, or was there something more at play? The investigation was far from over. As the investigation progressed, a shocking revelation emerged that would change everything detectives thought they knew about the night of John Smith's murder. It wasn't just John's infidelity that had caused the violent confrontation between him and Sarah. It was the dark secret that Sarah herself had been hiding. The police discovered that Sarah had been involved in an affair of her own, a relationship with a man named Ben Rogers, someone who had been close to both Sarah and John for years. Ben had been a friend of the family, someone John had trusted, and his betrayal cut even deeper. Sarah and Ben's affair had been ongoing for several months, but it was far from a simple romance. Ben, it seemed, had become increasingly possessive and controlling, pushing Sarah to make difficult decisions. His obsession with her grew to dangerous levels, and he made it clear that he was not willing to let her go. Investigators learned that Ben had been secretly manipulating Sarah, convincing her that John's affair was the final straw in their marriage and that she deserved better. When the confrontation between Sarah and John erupted that night, Ben had been lurking in the shadows, watching from a distance, waiting for the perfect moment to step in. His plan was not to save Sarah from a violent argument. It was to manipulate the situation to his advantage. In the heat of the moment, Sarah had turned to him for support, and Ben had given her the strength to confront John, pushing her deeper into a violent outburst. Ben had even planted the idea in Sarah's mind that she needed to end the marriage for good, even if it meant taking drastic measures. What was supposed to be a simple confrontation had been orchestrated by Ben all along, and his involvement would soon become impossible to ignore. The investigation reached a shocking climax when Sarah's lover, Ben Rogers, was finally identified as the key figure in the tragic events of that night. His involvement in John's murder, which had initially seemed like a crime of passion, now appeared to be the result of a calculated and manipulative scheme. Ben had been a trusted friend of the Smith family, someone John had never suspected of harboring ill intentions. But beneath the surface, Ben's jealousy and obsession had been festering for months. After learning of John's affair, Ben saw an opportunity to manipulate Sarah into making a life-altering decision. He convinced her that the only way to escape the emotional turmoil of her marriage was to act on her anger and end things once and for all. But Ben's manipulation didn't stop there. On the night of the murder, he had been in constant contact with Sarah, egging her on during the heated argument with John. He encouraged her to confront her husband with the anger and betrayal she had felt for so long. When the argument escalated into violence, Ben was waiting in the wings, poised to take control of the situation. What no one knew at the time was that Ben had made the fateful 911 call, not to help, but to cover his tracks. He knew that once the police arrived, Sarah would be the prime suspect, and he planned to distance himself from the entire situation. But his plan unraveled quickly. Investigators were able to trace the call, and soon Ben's role in the murder became undeniable. In the end, Sarah was arrested, and her shocking confession revealed the full extent of Ben's manipulation. The courtroom was left stunned as the twisted truth came to light. The murder wasn't just a crime of passion. It was the result of a calculated plot driven by jealousy, obsession, and betrayal.